It was a Thursday morning in October of 2003 when I drove out to the Hargrove place and made the worst-looking decision of my life. I was 61 years old then, retired from active farming, more or less, though retirement never really means what people think it means when you've spent 40 years working land. You don't stop noticing things. You don't stop caring about what happens to old properties. Some habits don't leave you just because your knees start telling you to slow down. The Hargrove estate sale had been announced in the Callaway County Courier 2 weeks prior. 83 acres out on Route 7, just past the old grain elevator that burned down in '94. The Hargroves had been one of the founding families out here in western Kentucky, and when the last of them, old Clement Hargrove, who everybody called Clem, passed that August at 91 years old, the estate went to a nephew out in Cincinnati who'd never set foot on the property more than twice in his life. That nephew hired an auction company out of Paducah to liquidate everything. And I do mean everything. I wasn't planning to bid on much, maybe some old hand tools if the prices stayed reasonable. I had no use for more equipment, no real plans for any expansion. My son Dale had made that clear enough at Thanksgiving the year before. He was an accountant in Nashville by then, had been for 12 years, and he didn't see any reason for me to keep acquiring things I couldn't work myself. He wasn't wrong technically. But I went out there anyway that Thursday morning, the way you do when you've known a piece of land your whole life and you feel like you owe it one last look. The auction drew maybe 40 people. Some legitimate farmers, a few dealers who drove up from Tennessee, a couple of young men who flipped old equipment and sold it online. The auctioneer was a man named Rusty Bevins who I'd known since we were in the FFA together back in high school. Rusty had made a career of it, and he was good, fast, professional, knew how to work a crowd. The first few hours went fine. Equipment sold for fair prices. The old John Deere 4020 went for more than it was worth. A set of hay forks disappeared fast. The barn contents cleared out in under an hour. Then they got to the silo. It stood at the northeast corner of the property, maybe 200 yards from the main barn. Concrete stave construction, which was common in this part of Kentucky through the 50s and 60s. 50 feet tall, maybe 18 feet in diameter. The kind of structure that takes decades to build equity into and about 15 years of neglect to turn into a liability. This one had been neglected. The concrete staves had cracked in several places along the lower third. The roof cap was partially collapsed on one side, which meant water had been getting in. The access ladder on the outside was missing rungs from about the 12-foot mark upward. The bottom door, a small wooden hatch set into the concrete at ground level, had been nailed shut with boards so old they'd turned gray. Rusty didn't spend much time on it. Lot 47, he said, looking down at his clipboard. Concrete silo circa 1955 or thereabouts, structural integrity unknown, sold as is, where is. You haul it or you demo it, that's your business. Who'll start me at 50? Silence. 25. More silence. A man in a red cap near the back shifted his weight and looked at the ground, which in auction language means I'm not touching that. $10, Rusty said, almost to himself. Somebody give me $10 for a 50-foot concrete silo. I raised my hand. The laughter started almost immediately. Not mean laughter exactly. More the kind that comes out of people who think they're watching someone make a harmless mistake. The dealer from Tennessee, heavy man, drove a white pickup, said something to the man next to him, and they both chuckled. One of the young equipment flippers shook his head like he was watching a child try to pick up something too heavy. Rusty pointed at me, sold to Earl Meacham for $10. He moved on. My neighbor Gerald Pitts found me afterward, while people were loading equipment onto trailers. Gerald farms 300 acres about a mile south of my place, and we've known each other going on 50 years. "Earl," he said, slow and careful, the way you talk to someone who might be having a medical episode. "What are you going to do with that thing?" "I don't know yet," I said. He nodded in that way that means I'll leave it alone because I respect you, but I think you've lost your mind. I didn't blame him. I wasn't entirely sure myself. Something about that silo hadn't sat right with me from the moment I walked the property the week before, doing the pre-auction walkthrough. It wasn't the structure itself. Old silos are common out here. Half of them are in worse shape than that one. What nagged at me was the door. That small wooden hatch at the base, nailed shut with gray boards. Nothing unusual about that. Owners close things up all the time. But those boards had been nailed from the asterisk outside. That's how you close a building you're done with. Lock it up and walk away. Except, two of those boards had been pried up at one end and then re-nailed. Not by me. Not recently. The nail holes were old, and whoever had done it had bent the original nails and driven new ones alongside them. It was rough work, done quickly. The kind of thing you do when you need to get back inside a place that's already been closed up, and you don't want anyone to know you've been there. Clem Hargrove had lived alone on that property for the last 18 years of his life, after his wife Edna passed in 1985. He was a private man, didn't entertain much. His nephew out in Cincinnati admitted to the estate attorney that he'd only visited twice, and both times Clem had met him at the front porch and hadn't invited him inside the house. I'd known Clem Hargrove to wave at and exchange weather reports with for 40 years. We'd never been close. He was a generation ahead of me, which in rural counties means more distance than the years suggest. But something about those re-nailed boards made me think about him. Made me wonder what an old man in his 70s and 80s had been doing alone in a deteriorating silo on a property he was otherwise letting go to grass. I paid Rusty Bevins my $10 and got a receipt. Then I went home, had supper, and didn't sleep well. My wife Ruth had been gone for 4 years by then. Pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in October of 1999, and she died the following March, which gave us 5 months. We used them well, I think. As well as you can. She died at home, in the bedroom we'd shared for 37 years, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the window was the particular shade of yellow that only happens in early spring in Kentucky. I don't say much about it, usually. There isn't much to say that amounts to anything. But I'll mention it here because it's relevant to what happened next, and to why I cared at all about an old man's habits and private business. When you're alone, you develop habits that other people would find hard to explain. You tend to things that don't strictly need tending. You go back to places because the going back is part of what gets you through the day. And you get very private about certain things, not because you're hiding them exactly, but because they belong to a part of yourself that doesn't translate into regular conversation. I understood, in a way I couldn't quite articulate, why Clem Hargrove might have been visiting a broken-down silo on a cold morning and re-nailing the door behind him. I just didn't know what was inside. I drove back out to the Hargrove place the following Saturday morning. The estate attorney had given me access. Technically, I owned Lot 47 now, which included the silo and the 12 square feet of concrete pad it stood on. The rest of the property was pending sale to a developer out of Murray who planned to subdivide it. The morning was cold, November coming in early the way it does some years. The sky was the color of old tin, low and flat, and the grass along the fence line had gone brown and stiff. I wore my Carhartt jacket and brought a crowbar, a flashlight, and a pair of work gloves. I pulled the boards off the door without much trouble. The wood was soft with age, and the nails came out easy. The hatch itself was small, maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. Original to the construction, designed for a man to stoop through when accessing the base of the silo for cleanout. The smell that came out when I opened it was dry and dusty, with something under it I couldn't immediately name. Not rot, Not mold, at least not much. Something older, like a barn that hasn't been opened in a decade. But also like, and this sounds strange, I know, like the inside of an old book. That faint, dry sweetness of paper that's been sitting in still air for a long time. I put the flashlight beam inside before I put my head in. The interior was clear of debris at the base. No grain, no silage, nothing. Whatever the silo had last been used for, it had been cleaned out. The concrete walls were dry on the inside, which surprised me given the cracked staves and the damaged roof cap. I'd expected standing water, or at least heavy moisture damage. Instead, the floor was swept clean. Not just empty, swept. There were scrape marks in the old dust near the doorway, the kind you get when someone drags a broom across concrete. Deliberate. Someone had cleaned the floor of this silo. I got down on one knee in the doorway, studying the floor without going inside yet. That was when I saw the light. It was faint, so faint I wasn't sure of it at first. Mid-morning, overcast sky, the beam from my flashlight was the only source of illumination I'd expected to find. But there it was, a thin line of light, pale and yellowish, coming up from the floor near the center of the silo, maybe 30 inches from the base of the wall on the east side. Not from above, from below. I went inside. The gap was small, a crack in the concrete floor, maybe an inch wide, running about 8 inches in length. It ran perpendicular to the wall, a natural fracture, the kind that happens in old concrete when the ground settles, except the concrete around it had been swept clean, deliberately clean, and there was no matching settling crack anywhere else on the floor I could see. I knelt down and put my eye near the gap. It was dark below, but the yellow glow was there. Diffuse, not electric, more like the dying end of something, like the last hour of daylight coming through a dirty window underground. I put my hand over the crack and felt air. Not cold air rising the way you get from a cave or a cellar that's open to the ground. Warmer air slightly, moving slowly, the way air moves through old wood structures that breathe with changes in temperature. There was a space below the floor of that silo. I went home and I thought about it for 3 days. It was the kind of thing that made me go back to my own memories, sifting through things I hadn't thought about in years. My father, Raymond Meacham, had farmed 200 acres just 3 miles from where I was sitting, and he'd known every farm in the county the way you know neighbors when there's nothing between you but fence lines and common seasons. I remembered him saying something about the Hargrove place years ago. I couldn't pin the year, but it was sometime in the mid-60s, when I was a teenager and helping him with the winter wheat. We'd been driving past the north edge of the Hargrove property on the county road, and he'd said something I hadn't really registered at the time. He'd said that families got more below ground than above it. I'd thought he meant debt. In those days, a lot of families did. The 60s were not uniformly good years for small farms in western Kentucky, and talk of financial trouble was common enough that his comment hadn't seemed remarkable. But standing in my kitchen on a November evening in 2003, with mud on my boots and a 3-day question in my head, I heard those words again differently. More below ground than above it. On the 4th day, I went back with better equipment. I brought a longer pry bar, a battery-powered work light on a cord, a tape measure, and my old camera, a 35mm film camera I'd had since the early 80s. I also brought a notebook and a pencil, which felt a little foolish, but I've always kept notes when I'm working on something I don't understand. The light in the crack was gone that morning. The sky had cleared overnight, and it was full sun, which meant whatever had created the glow on Saturday was dependent on some specific angle or atmospheric condition that wasn't present today. I didn't let that change my plans. I measured the crack precisely, 8¼ inches long, just under an inch wide at its widest point. I measured its position, 31 inches from the east wall, 11 inches from the south side of the silo's interior. Then I started working the concrete around the crack with the pry bar. The silo floor was not poured as one continuous slab. That's not uncommon in construction of that era. The base was laid in sections, and whoever had poured it had not done a perfect job at the seams. The section containing the crack was the easternmost pour, and it had separated slightly from the adjacent section over the decades. It took me the better part of 2 hours. The section came up in pieces, heavy, dense chunks of concrete that I moved to the far side of the silo interior. Underneath was dark soil, recently dry, and then, about 6 inches down, wood. Old wood-fitted boards running north-south. A hatch of some kind, hand-built, tongue-and-groove boards like the kind you'd use on a root cellar door, fitted tight enough to keep out moisture and rodents. There was a recessed iron ring on one end, old and surface-rusted but solid. I pulled it open. The air that came out was warm and dry and smelled strongly of paper, old cloth, and something else. A faint sweetness I associated, without knowing exactly why, with cedar. Below was a wooden ladder, descending about 8 feet into darkness. I didn't go down that day. I want to be clear about that. I'm 61 years old and I'm alone, and going down a hand-built ladder into an underground chamber on a property I've owned for less than 2 weeks, with nobody knowing where I am, is the kind of thing that ends up as a small notice in the county paper and a warning told to grandchildren. I went home. I called Gerald Pitts and told him what I'd found. Gerald, to his considerable credit, did not say "I told you so" about the $10 silo purchase, because he had actually predicted it would be worthless. Instead, he said he'd come out with me the following morning. We met at the Hargrove place at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, the air cold enough to see your breath. Gerald had brought a better flashlight than mine and a length of rope, which was the kind of practical thinking that makes him a good neighbor. I went down first. The chamber below the silo was roughly rectangular, about 14 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling height of just over 6 feet, enough to stand upright. The walls were dressed limestone, fitted without mortar, which was old construction, pre-concrete, and had held up extraordinarily well. The floor was packed earth, dry and firm. The room had been used for a long time. There were shelves along the long walls, built from poplar boards and fitted into notches cut into the limestone. On those shelves, canning jars, some empty and some still sealed with wax-dipped lids. Old tins, coffee tins, tobacco tins, the kind with hinged lids, canvas bags folded flat, and at the far end of the room against the south wall, a wooden chest. Low, wide, not fancy, more like a storage trunk than any kind of decorative furniture. The source of the light from Saturday, I found it immediately. On the east wall, about 6 inches below the ceiling, there was a gap in the limestone where a stone had shifted slightly over the years. On a clear morning at a specific angle, sunlight would come through that gap and down through the crack in the concrete floor above. By mid-morning on a cloudy day, you'd see nothing. On a clear morning like that Saturday, it filtered through like a lantern with the wick turned low. Gerald was right behind me, his flashlight sweeping the room. "Lord," he said quietly. It was the right word for it. The jars on the shelves, the sealed ones, contained seeds. I could tell from the size and shape of them, most of them small and dark against the wavy old glass. There were paper labels on some of the jars, written in pencil in a small, precise hand, corn varieties I didn't recognize, bean types that weren't in any modern catalog I'd seen, and something on the labels I hadn't expected: dates, years, 1941, 1949, 1956, 1963. Someone had been collecting and storing seeds down here for at least 2 decades, maybe more. The tins contained other things. I opened several carefully. Old documents, folded flat and wrapped in oilcloth. A surveying map of what appeared to be the Hargrove property, hand-drawn, with measurements and notations in the same small handwriting as the seed jar labels. A ledger book, its cover so faded I couldn't read the title without bringing it into the light. And in the chest at the far end, more ledgers, notebooks, what looked like a complete record of some kind kept over many years. Gerald looked at me over his flashlight beam. "Earl," he said, "who built this?" "I don't know," I said. But I was already pretty sure I knew who had been using asterisk it. I spent 2 more days removing the contents of the chamber carefully, carrying everything up the ladder and laying it out in my truck bed, then transferring it to my kitchen table at home. I documented as I went, photographs with the old 35mm camera, written notes about the position of each item on each shelf. I had no way of knowing, at that point, what any of it might mean legally or historically or to anyone at all. The ledgers went back to 1931. The first one, the oldest, its pages brown and fragile at the edges, was not in the handwriting I'd seen on the seed labels and the maps. This was a different hand, larger, less precise, the kind of writing common to men who learned it from a one-room schoolhouse and didn't use it much except when necessary. The name on the inside cover was Harlan Hargrove, Clement Hargrove's father. Harlan Hargrove died in 1952. I knew that from county records I'd checked after the auction, more out of habit than expectation. He died at 73, which meant he'd been born in 1879 and had started that first ledger when he was 52 years old. The ledger was not a financial record. It wasn't a farm journal in the conventional sense. It was a seed record. Harlan Hargrove had been documenting varieties. Every entry listed a plant type, a row number in his fields, a date of harvest, a count of seeds stored, and notes on the season, rainfall, temperature, disease pressure, how the variety had performed compared to the previous year. He'd been doing this systematically, carefully, going back to 1931 and probably further, though that first ledger was the earliest one. It took me the better part of a week to go through the ledgers carefully, sitting at my kitchen table in the evenings with a pot of coffee and the reading glasses I'd started needing full-time around age 58. I worked slowly, because some of the handwriting was difficult, and because some of what I was reading required time to absorb. What Harlan had started, Clem had continued. The handwriting in the ledgers shifted sometime in the late 1940s, still careful, still systematic, but different, and the scope expanded. Where Harlan had focused primarily on corn and bean varieties specific to their ground, Clem had begun collecting varieties from other farms in the county. There were names recorded alongside certain entries, families who had grown specific varieties for generations. The Dunaway Farm, the Watchter Place, the old Sizemore homestead out past the creek. People who had been farming the same ground their families had homesteaded, with seeds they'd selected and saved going back to the mid-1800s. Clem Hargrove had been, in the most informal and unacknowledged way imaginable, building a seed library. Not for money, not for recognition, for the same reason you write down what you know before you forget it, because the knowing matters, and because things disappear if nobody tends to them. I called the University of Kentucky Extension office in early December. I got transferred 3 times before I reached a woman named Dr. Alicia Hendren, who was an agricultural historian working out of the College of Agriculture in Lexington. I told her what I had. I was as plain as I could be about it: an old silo, a hidden room, seed jars going back to the 1940s, ledgers going back to 1931. She drove out from Lexington on a Friday. She was younger than I expected, 40 maybe, sharp and quiet and careful in a way that reminded me of the best kind of farmer, the kind who looks before they touch anything. She went through the materials I'd laid out on my kitchen table with the concentrated attention of someone who already understands what they're looking at and is just confirming what they suspected. After about an hour, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Meacham," she said, "do you know how many of these varieties are still commercially available?" I said I didn't. "Almost none of them," she said. Maybe 3 or 4 out of what I'm counting as 47 documented varieties. The rest were displaced by hybrid seed introduction in the 50s and 60s. Farmers who had been saving those varieties shifted to commercial hybrids, better yields, better disease resistance, fine reasons, but the old varieties went with them when they stopped. So they're gone, I said. For most farmers, yes, but the seeds in those jars, if viability has been maintained, those varieties aren't gone. They're here, she paused. A seed that's been stored correctly can remain viable for 20, 30 years, some longer. We won't know until we test them. But she stopped herself. This is significant. I looked down at the ledger open in front of me. Clem Hargrove's precise, small handwriting. A date in September of 2001, 2 years before he died, recording a successful germination test on a variety of white flint corn his father had first documented in 1934. He'd been testing them, right up near the end. He knew what he had, and he'd kept it going, alone, in a chamber under a silo that he'd let look completely worthless to anyone who might have cared to take it from him. The more I thought about it, the more it made a kind of sense that I recognized. These old farmers, Harlan's generation and to some degree Clem's, they'd lived through the Depression. They'd watched families lose everything. They'd watched the government come in and tell them what to plant, what to grow, what to buy. They'd watched the seed companies follow close behind, selling them something that grew better in the short term but didn't save true, so you had to buy new seed every year. They'd watched a certain kind of independence quietly disappear from farming, variety by variety, season by season. Harlan Hargrove had seen it coming. He'd built a room below a concrete floor where nobody would look, and he'd started putting things in it. Not gold, not guns, seeds. The most practical and stubborn kind of resistance available to a man farming in western Kentucky in 1931. And Clem had understood what his father was doing, and kept it going for another 50 years after him. He'd never married. He'd never had children. He'd kept this place going, kept them going, those jars on those shelves, through changes in farming, changes in the county, changes in the whole country, until his body finally gave out at 91 years old. He died without telling anyone. Not from forgetfulness or isolation or eccentricity. On purpose. He'd known that a nephew in Cincinnati and an auction company out of Paducah would not protect what was below that silo. He'd known that the only way to keep it was to let the property appear worthless until someone came along who might understand. Or maybe he'd just run out of time. Maybe he'd meant to make arrangements and simply hadn't gotten there. You live your whole life expecting more seasons than you get. I won't pretend to know what Clem Hargrove intended, but I know what I found, and I know what I did with it. Dr. Hendren coordinated with the UK Seed Preservation Program. Germination tests were run on all 47 documented varieties through the winter of 2003 and into spring of 2004. 31 came back viable, some at high rates, some at low rates requiring additional regeneration cycles, but alive, genetically intact, available. They gave proper documentation to each variety, cross-referenced against Harlan's original ledger entries and Clem's decades of follow-on notes. Where family names had been recorded, the Dunaway variety of spotted pole bean, the Sizemore white corn, the Watchter's October bean, those names were preserved in the records. I testified to the estate proceedings about the discovery. The nephew in Cincinnati had no claim on the contents of an underground room he'd never known existed on a property he'd already sold. The legal end of it was handled by people who understand those things, and I won't go into it further than that. Some of those varieties are now in the USDA Agricultural Research Service collection. Some are maintained by a regional seed preservation network that Dr. Hendren helped establish with funding she put together through the university. A few of them, the corn varieties especially, are being grown out again by small farms in this part of the state. I kept the first ledger, Harlan Hargrove's from 1931. The estate attorney raised an eyebrow about it, and I told him it was a personal record of sentimental value only, which was technically accurate, and he let it go. It sits on the shelf in my front room, next to a photograph of Ruth and me taken at the county fair in 1987. I'm not sure why I put it there exactly, except that it seemed right to have it near something else I'd kept from a life that no longer exists in exactly that form. Some evenings when the light is long and the house is quiet, I'll take it down and look at a page or two. The entries are plain: a date, a variety name, a row number, seed count, notes on the weather. October 7, 1938. White dent corn, row 14 east, seed count 340, dry season, small ears, flavor good. Nothing dramatic in it, nothing designed to be found or admired. Just a man writing down what he knew in a room below the ground because the knowing was worth keeping. My son Dale came out for Christmas that year, 2003, the year I bought the silo. I told him the story over the course of 2 evenings. He's an accountant. He thinks in numbers and risks and probabilities. He sat quiet through most of it, which for Dale means he's paying close attention. When I finished, he said, "You paid $10. "That's right," I said. He nodded slowly, and nobody else bid. "Nope." He looked at the ledger on the shelf for a moment. "How did you know?" he said. "Those boards on the door, how did you know there was something worth knowing in there?" I thought about that for a while. "I didn't," I said finally. "I just didn't like the way it looked. Something about it didn't sit right. The boards had been pried up and re-nailed. Someone had been getting in. An old man alone on a property going into a broken-down silo. That's not nothing." "Could have been anything," he said. "Sure," I said. "Could have been nothing, usually is." He was quiet another moment. "But you went anyway," he said. "I went anyway," I said. I've thought about Clem Hargrove a lot since then. Not constantly, but the way you think about a person who left something behind that changes how you see a place you thought you already knew. I think about what it took to maintain that, the discipline of it. Going down that ladder every season, season after season, testing germination rates, recording results in a small notebook, doing it alone without recognition or compensation or even the ability to explain to another living soul why it mattered. Keeping the door looking closed and nailed shut. Letting the property look as worthless as possible to anyone who might come looking. 83 acres, one man, 40 years of patient private work. He didn't need anyone to understand it while he was alive. He just needed it to still be there when someone came along who might. Gerald Pitts asked me, the following spring, if I regretted buying the silo. We were leaning on the fence between his south field and the old Hargrove boundary, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks work a field mouse somewhere in the brown grass. It was March. The ground was soft, and you could smell the first real warmth coming back into the soil, that particular smell that doesn't have a name but that every farmer knows and never gets tired of. "No," I said. "Worth more than $10, you think?" he said, half smiling. I looked out across the field for a while. "Some things," I said, "don't really have a dollar number on them." Gerald nodded. He understood that well enough. He's farmed the same ground his grandfather farmed, and he knows the feeling of standing on land that remembers more than you do. We watched the hawks for a while without saying anything else. That was fine. That was more than enough. The silo itself came down in the spring of 2004. The developer who'd bought the rest of the Hargrove property had it demolished as part of site preparation. I watched from the county road the morning they brought the equipment in. It took about 40 minutes to bring down something that had taken decades to build and another 5 decades to slowly decay. That's how it usually goes. But the room below it is still there, I think. Underground chambers built from fitted limestone tend to outlast everything around them. The concrete is gone and the silo is gone and the farmstead will be gone before too long, replaced by whatever the developer has planned for it. Below the surface, in the dark, a room still exists where a father and then a son spent the better part of a century, preserving what they could of a world they could already see passing away. I find some comfort in that. I'm not sure I could explain exactly why. But I think about it on certain kinds of mornings, cold mornings in November, when the sky is the color of old tin, and the grass is stiff and brown along the fence lines. And it seems to me like the most sensible thing a man could do with the time he's given. Put something away. Keep it going. Leave it for whoever comes next. Earl Meacham lives in Callaway County, Kentucky. He is 73 years old. He still keeps a garden.